Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back again to our lunchtime series of webinars from the Ireland Chapter of the PMI. This is our second one back after the break, and today we're talking about change and getting to the heart of change. And welcome Adrienne Gibson, who has very kindly agreed to speak to us and our members today. Hi, Adrienne.
Hi.
So Adrienne is a keynote speaker, and she actually already has quite a bit of experience speaking to PMI members, and she has spoken at the annual conferences in Budapest and in Bulgaria. She is most commonly found as a keynote speaker and leading change workshops and initiatives with leaders, and she does that across the world. And you'll hear shortly that she does have a little bit of an accent, so she has a lot of work on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. You can check her out here on her linkedin.com profile as well if you want to know a little bit more about her. So before we kick off and before I hand over the reins to Adrienne, just a reminder to everyone that to please grab your phone, go to menti.com and use the code that you can see on the screen there. I will pop it into the chat in Zoom as we go along as well. So as always, we're welcoming your interaction throughout the webinar, and we want to hear a little bit from you today about where you're joining us from. And also I'm looking to find out timings around webinars. Is the lunchtime suiting you? Would you have a preference maybe to go for an evening webinar also? And we also plan some time at the end of the webinar to have maybe answer any of your questions or take some of your comments. So Adrienne has also popped a couple of questions in for us as well. So we'll keep you going as we go along with a lot of questions and keep your interaction. So Adrienne, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Katrina. I'm really pleased to be here. So am I okay? I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen if that's all right.
Perfect. That came up already. Excellent. Okay, guys.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be joining you guys today. As Katrina mentioned, I've had the pleasure of working with a couple of PMI groups previously, so it's always a great experience for me to come back and talk with you guys, because while I've not been a formal project manager, I have run quite a lot of projects over the years, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. So I feel like I have a bit of an affinity for the PMI group. I'll start off by telling you a little bit about myself. I've actually, as you can tell, Katrina said I do have a bit of an accent. I actually grew up in Alabama, but I've been living in the UK now for the last 11 years, and I've been working internationally across about 100 countries for the last 14, 15 years. I am a veteran of the human resources profession, so I spent 20 years in corporate HR roles in a variety of types, mostly a generalist running different functions, but I always had a special fondness for people and leadership development. So over the years, I developed a bit of an expertise around developing people and leadership. Now, my work, as I mentioned, I've run quite a lot of projects. I've always been a bit on the operational side of human resources and have been kind of chief of staff, sort of project liaison, leading projects for a variety of different either systems, tools, organizational structures, culture, a variety of different types of change programs. And so for about the last 14 years, I've developed a bit of a specialism in leading change initiatives around the world in a variety of different industries. Largely, my experience has been predominantly in financial services, pharmaceuticals, and in healthcare as well, but I kind of span a variety of different industries. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor for what my background has been, and perhaps a peek into why I'm so passionate about the topic we're here to speak about today, getting to the heart of change, because I'm a big believer in the heart of the business is really its people. And when we are driving change, as many of you do in the various projects that you will be running in your organizations, it's how do we get people on board with change? So that's enough about me. I'd love to hear a little bit more about you. I know Katrina had some polling questions to tell us a bit about where you're from and what industries you're from. So I'd love to see that, Katrina.
Yep, let me just pop into it, guys. So I'll just move, I'll take over the screen for a second. So we just, I'm just going to pop backwards, guys, on the Menti code. So we have, so guys, you can hopefully see my screen there. If you grab your phone, go to menti.com. If you have two screens with your laptop, you can probably just open this up on another screen as well. But use the code 1432016. And so as you can see, Adrienne, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the geography of Ireland, but we actually have, while we have quite a lot of people joining us from Dublin, we actually have people from the four corners. We've got Limerick, we've got Galway, and we've got Cork as well. So the some might say the real capital of Ireland, Cork, is in here as well. And we also have somebody joining us from London. So you have
yeah, apparently it must be my neighbor next door. And I am pretty familiar with Ireland, to be perfectly honest, and not just because this is the group I'm talking to. It's my favorite country in Europe to have visited. So I've been quite a few times.
It's, yeah, we're close by. You've no excuse, you're only next door. So as you can see, guys, hopefully you can see it there, we do get quite a mix of different organizations that people work for in terms of our PMI membership. So there's a mix across pharma. So pharmaceutical industry would be quite I suppose a big industry in Ireland, as well as financial services. But we've got insurance, we've got finance, we've got electronic marketing, we've got education, we've got health, we've got telecoms. So we've got quite a mix today, and I think it's safe to say, Adrienne, that mix is definitely supported by the topic of getting to the heart of change, because I think we're all experiencing it at the moment. Yeah. And I'll hand back to you now, but there's just a couple of more questions, guys. And during this, Adrienne has a couple of questions linked to the topic to get your input and your feedback on what you might think are maybe some of the tougher aspects of change as well. So, and we can pop back into this in a couple of minutes, Adrienne. I'll hand you back the screen for now.
And thank you for that, Katrina, because I do prefer to have an interactive session where we can have a bit of an exchange. I know it's a little bit difficult when we're on a setup like this, but we'll do our best and have some interaction throughout. So thank you guys for sharing a little bit about who you are. It's nice for me to see who's on the line today. So I'd like to share with you this change model that it's my own, and I'll talk to you a little bit about it. But over the 14 years that I've been leading change programs, and I mentioned in different cultures and different industries, what I've done is I've developed a bit of an experience with what works and what doesn't. And I'll be perfectly frank with you to say that I've learned just as much about what not to do from situations that haven't gone very well as I have about what to do, and probably more learnings from what not to do. So for the purpose of today, looking at this particular change model, it actually is more like a 2-day workshop for us to go through the whole thing. But for today, we're going to focus more on what makes change hard. We'll talk a little bit about why change efforts typically fail, and some ways that you can get people more engaged with whatever change program that you may be running. Now, I'm sure I'm not the only one on the call who's had a mixed bag of outcomes or successes when it comes to change programs. And there have been times that I have called something a success because we ticked every box on the project plan, etc. But when I went into a particular country to see for myself how a change had been implemented, realized that actually what I had called a success really wasn't, because what was happening on the ground is very different than what I might have expected. So I'd like to hear from you guys. Katrina, if you can help us out with the next question. I'd like to hear from you. How is it that you typically define success of the projects and programs that you're leading?
Okay, guys, I'll just move forward. So the couple of screens going here, it's always good. So how do we know if change has been a success? And I've just opened the question up on the Menti poll there, guys. So we've got 4 options there. So how do we know if change has been a success? Project timeline is completed, we've met our budget, behaviors and way of operating have changed, or it's been implemented without glitches, problems, or delays. So let me share my screen there, because people are already giving their answers to this one. So it's, hopefully you can see that there.
Wow. we have an incredibly astute group because we're very much aligned.
It's interesting as well. It probably depends often on what the topic of conversation is about, because I'm sure if we asked the head of finance, they'd say, well, you didn't spend more money than I gave you. But that's interesting to see that behaviours and the way of operating is definitely coming out on top for you.
Yeah, that's right. I'm really pleased to see. Sounds like we're on the same wavelength then with how we measure success. For sharing that, Katrina. You know, I've learned through my own experiences that I can have the best project plans, the richest budgets, the latest tools and technology. And I've been really fortunate over the years to work with some very talented people around the world with the change programs I've been leading. But at the end of the day, that's not necessarily what makes a change program successful. As you guys clearly noted in the poll, the real definition of how we succeed or fail in change programs really is dependent upon the degree of change that we have in people's behaviors, ways of thinking, ways of working, etc. And that's the part that I'd like for us to focus on today, is how we drive more of that with the changing, I like to say, changing hearts, minds, behaviors, and perspectives. And how do we do that? So when we think about what makes change hard, let's look at when we think about an organization. Every organization either provides a product or a service to whatever community they serve. Inside that organization are a variety of people who play a different role in creating or delivering that product or service to their customers. When we peel back the layers a little bit further, hopefully what we see is a very diverse group of individuals with people of different ages, races, genders, religions, cultures, etc. Hopefully we see a pretty diverse group. And when we are looking at people in this kind of diversity, everyone comes to that organization, to their role, to their team with different experiences, different upbringings, different philosophies on life and ways of working. And then to take it just one step further, when we start looking at the individual, what we see is that every person is completely unique. So even if we come from a similar part of the world, or we've had similar experiences, I saw many of you have been in financial services, pharma, healthcare, just like me, we will each have had completely different experiences with that, but also at the head and heart level, we're wired differently. We all have very different hopes and dreams, aspirations, things that resonate well with us. And we also have very different fears and insecurities and judgments that we hold as well. The way that we all process and think about information or sharing information, the kinds of information that appeals to us, will also be very different. So if you think about that and the organization that you're in, about any change programs that you might be leading, how many unique perspectives may there be in your organization that you're now trying to all corral them into one direction for the project or change program that you're leading? Perhaps it feels a little something like this at times. I know that's been the case for me, that when I've been trying to corral a group of people to get them to think and operate in a similar way, it can often feel like herding cats. Now let's think about something on a more personal level for a moment. I'm going to stop sharing just for a bit. When we think about something that we're trying to change on a personal level, I'd like to see a show of hands, if we can, from the participants. If you can just do the quick hand raise. If you've ever tried to change a habit or a behavior. It could be changing some habit that you may have had in the past and you want it to be different. Oftentimes I find with people it's diet, exercise, smoking, things like that. Or if you have wanted to start a new habit, create something new. Can I see a quick raise of hands from the participants? Let's see here. Yeah.
Yeah, you're getting a lot of hands raised there. I'll raise mine too.
Yeah, I'm going to raise both because I'm
Yeah.
one of those people who, if you can change it, I've pretty much done that. So, well, great. Then you've all had some sort of personal experience then when it comes to trying to make change. And, you know, the fact of the matter is that human beings often struggle when it comes to making change. We get into a bit of a norm, a habit, a routine, or a comfort zone. And it can be very difficult for many people to break out of that. You probably heard the old saying that it takes 28 days to change a habit. I mean, it really does have to get to the point where we're creating new habits when we truly make change. So I'll tell you a little bit about an experience I had. So I've been driving in America for, oh gosh, I probably don't want to say, about 34, 35 years. And while I've lived in the UK now for the last 11 years, I didn't have to drive. I just took advantage of public transport. And in the last year, I decided that I wanted to get my license to give me a little bit of freedom, which I have to say, in the COVID era, thank heavens for that, because I'm no longer reliant on public transport. So it was a wise decision to do that last year, not knowing what this year had to bring. But for me, you're talking about a veteran driver that I've been driving by myself since the age of probably 14, and then, you know, with parents and things probably a little bit earlier than that. And I've always been comfortable driving pretty much any kind of vehicle. We won't say like a semi-truck or anything like that, but I think what my dad drives is probably pretty darn close to that. It's like a bus. It's one of these classic American Ford F-150 four-door trucks with a full-length cab. And when I'm driving that, it really does feel like I'm driving a bit of a school bus. But when I started taking my lessons in the UK last November, I was driving a Mini Cooper. So quite a big difference. I'd never driven anything quite that small before. But I have to admit, I was massively intimidated. The road sizes here are completely different. And I found myself in that little Mini, tucking myself in sometimes, worried that the car next to me, or heaven forbid, it might have been a bus next to me, that they were going to hit me, right? Because I'm accustomed to a wider width of road. There's the obvious things where I was learning to drive on a manual transmission, and I'm accustomed to a right-hand manual, which is obviously not the case. So changing to the left, driving on the left. But even in the UK, one of the things that came as a huge surprise to me is that you could be on a 4 or 6 lane motorway that is all of a sudden down to 2, and you're at a roundabout in a 30-mile-per-hour zone, you know, just like this. So it took an incredible amount of adjustment for me to break those habits. So in that circumstance where I am a very comfortable driver, probably a little bit too comfortable with my speeding and things back in the States, which I've also learned is very different here. You know, speed cameras are very different from patrol cars on the side of the road, but we won't talk about my speeding techniques. But anyway, I was a really confident, comfortable driver until last year in November. And it felt like I was a nervous 14-year-old starting all over again. So even though I had learned so much and didn't even think about driving anymore, I was now having to go back and unlearn things, relearn new things that, quite frankly, made me incredibly uncomfortable. And I know I irritated my driving instructor for quite some time because the way I turned the wheel wasn't correct, and the way I signaled wasn't correct. And, you know, so many things that we don't think about when we just have been driving for so many years. So I share that example with you as one for you to think about in your organizations, the changes that people might be going through. It's what is the experience like for them? Is it, you know, you're taking someone who's a bit of an expert in one particular way of working, but we're changing the structure, the tools, the processes, etc., and we're now expecting people to show up in a completely different way. You know, it doesn't sadly happen like a flip the switch when it comes to change. We are wired in such a way that our brains find ways to create habits and patterns in the way that we think. And when we interrupt that, it literally takes a while to create new neural pathways for us to think in a different way. And this isn't about neuroscience. I would highly recommend looking at that, though, because it's fascinating. But just to share with you, when we're asking people to make change, if we think about it from the one-on-one human experience and what people are going through, there's a lot going on internally within people that we're asking them to adapt. So with that, I just want to talk a little bit more about some of the practical elements of what we're looking at when we're looking at asking people to make change. So bear with me, I'm going to share again. So when we're talking about why do people actually struggle with making change, if we look at this graph, we start with the place called endings, which I know may sound a little counterintuitive, but it's the ending of one way of working, one way of being. So we start with endings, and then that's a place where we're letting go. We've made a decision that we want to go to a new destination, or we want a new way of being, operating, practices, whatever it is that we're talking about, because this is applicable whether it's processes, systems, tools, culture, it's all the same thing, okay? So we start with endings, and then we're trying to head over to this space called new beginnings. And in the middle, what you see is this natural dip in productivity. So as we progress through a change, there's this period of time that people are a little uncomfortable. So in endings, we kind of know how things work. We know what to expect. We know what good looks like, what our bosses expect of us, what are our goals, who does what, with some degree of clarity. Then when we get into the space of the neutral zone, that's that awkward, uncomfortable place where we're like, I'm not sure who does what anymore, and I don't know what my role is, and what is that new process because it's unfamiliar. I don't really remember how we go about that. And in that space where there's that lack of clarity and there's all of this uncertainty going on, we see a natural dip in productivity as people are trying to find their way and get a bit more comfortable in the new way of operating or being before we move into that space of new beginnings. Now, just as an aside, this tends to be fairly cyclical, because what will end up happening over time is that new beginnings will eventually become endings, because we all know if there's anything constant in life, it's change. So at some point, the new beginning will most likely become an ending, and we go through that cycle all over again. Now, I don't know about you, but certainly there have been times when I've been leading projects and change programs, and then you implement it and you think, yeah, we're finished. And then suddenly the next year comes around and it looks like a very similar program to what we ran the year before. Usually that's a sign of the degree of implementation and whether or not it was a success. But it just goes to show that we're always in that process of going back and making change all over again. So if we look at this, it's fairly logical. We can see ending, new beginning. Yeah, we might have a dip in performance. This makes sense. But remember I said human beings, and we're all this mix of different stories and fears and insecurities and hopes and dreams and whatever. When we add that human element to this, it looks a little bit different. So I don't know about you, but this definitely looks like a little bit more like the change programs I've been accustomed to leading, where we have people all over the place, a convoluted mess of emotions with people in different places on that change curve. So you see that the graph kind of follows the same pattern, but the way that people's emotions tend to follow is kind of similar to what we talked about before, where you've got some people who are very enthusiastic early adopters that are like, yeah, I've been waiting for this change. I can't wait to get on board with it. And they might shoot straight off over to the right really quickly. You've got some that are, a bit resistant or confused by things or upset because the direction that you may be taking them is not one that they wanted to go on. But what you can see through this is that while the original curve we looked at is quite logical, people aren't always logical. You know, our wiring and the emotions and feelings that we have can create something very different at an internal experience when we're making change. So this is a point where I wanted to stop again, Katrina, because I would love to hear from our participants. Where do you find when you have people on your project change program, whatever you might be leading, where do you think people typically are on your change initiative?
Great, so hopefully people can see that. So people have already started to answer this one. So the next question, guys, is what is the most challenging for you when implementing change programs?
Awesome.
You've already got 27 answers on this, and there seems to be a leading answer.
Yeah, exactly. That's perfect. So I think, and again, we obviously have a lot of seasoned veterans of people who have been running projects and change programs, because I would agree that that is absolutely the toughest part. And we're going to come back to this in a little bit, but the space that many leaders don't recognize, if we don't get that part right, what's the impact on the project? Could we go to the next question as well, Katrina, which is where are people on the change curve with their projects and programs?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for anyone that's currently working on a project, where are you now? Where do you think the people are with? Are they all on board, or are they still in denial, maybe? I suppose it'll probably depend anyway, Adrienne, where because everyone's project is going to be at different stages. So
yeah.
I wonder, will we get any happiness?
Okay. So quite a balance between anxiety, fear, threat, and acceptance and moving forward. And thank you guys for sharing this. This is really helpful to see, and feel free to continue to add your answers if you like as we're continuing to talk. But I think that that's probably very indicative that we do tend to have a mix, and we always will. The thing about driving change programs is that we are working with human beings, and every person is unique, which means that they will respond to the change programs from a very different way. And as part of our job as project leaders or change leaders is to try to anticipate where those people are. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. So I'll go back to sharing. Right. Okay, so if we try to overlay the two between endings and new beginnings and what those emotions look like, this feels, I don't know about you, but it feels a little bit more manageable to me when we put it into this kind of perspective. When we are trying to understand what that experience is at a very unique personal level for people, we can get a better idea for how people are going through that kind of a process. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to point out here. This area where we have the dip in productivity, so you've got the line of normal productivity and then the dip in productivity. I don't want that to be viewed as only a bad thing, right? Yes, productivity dips aren't seen as good things. I understand that. However, it's a learning space as well. So one of the things that comes from this area is innovation, new ideas, people creating new ways of working and being. So part of what we want to do as we try to encourage people to move through this curve is we don't want to eliminate that middle portion, because that could stifle some of the ideas and creativity that we have that people are coming up with about the new way of working. So I don't want that to be misinterpreted as only a bad thing. The other thing too is that this curve is not linear. So we don't just start at endings and go straight to new beginnings. Again, because people are so unique, we may have people who progress forward for a ways, slip back, and then progress again. Some people may zip right over again, because I was saying there may be some people who are very excited about this particular change and they find it very easily. And yes, also some people are more resilient and adaptable to change in general as well. But even things that we can't see or understand at a very personal level. You could have someone who is typically very quick with change, easy to get on board, an early adopter under normal circumstances. But what if they've got something going on at home in their personal life that might be affecting them? Then you might find that they stay on that left-hand side of the curve a bit longer than normal. So even if you think you've got an individual that you feel pretty confident will move over quickly to the right, there could be things going on within them at the personal level that might have them show up in a slightly different way than they would otherwise. Okay. And then there are going to be some of those people who are just going to stay firmly planted in that anger category and dig their heels in because they just don't want this particular change to happen. So the thing is that while we've got this very logical curve we can look at, people, again, aren't necessarily always logical. And so we have to just try to recognize. The key for us is to try to get a sense for where people are and what they need to help them move forward on the curve. And because people are unique, different people may need different things. So I'll talk with you in a little bit more about what that looks like as far as how we might be able to help people move forward. Now, before we do, I want to tell you about an experience that I had. The most complicated change program I have ever run. It was a few years ago. I was working with an IT part of the business, and we were integrating 4 legacy businesses into one. I was working directly for the CIO, and we had about 2,000 IT professionals, both employees and contractors, in 43 countries that we wanted to merge into one. The parent company was Japanese. 2 of the companies that had been acquired by the Japanese company were American, and the 4th one was Swiss-based. They were all global, but that's where their headquarters were located. So just imagine for a moment the complexity of trying to integrate the 4 businesses in 43 countries, etc. It was a really complex task to undertake. Now, every legacy business had their own systems, tools, processes, structure, etc. And the goal that we had was to bring them into one IT organization and create harmony in the different platforms, etc. Now, as you can imagine, just from a cultural difference, we had the Japanese or the American companies, the 2 American companies, they were traditionally coming to the table with lots of ideas, really keen to get things moving quite quickly, a lot of solutions. The Japanese were a bit more reserved, wanting to be a bit more cautious to evaluate a variety of options before taking any steps towards any solutions. And the Swiss, well, of course they were neutral, right? So basically we had huge differences in the way that we were approaching the integration. And every legacy business had their own solution for how we did it. Their way, of course. The other 3 businesses could just adopt what they were doing because obviously that was the best idea. Now, just to make things a little bit more complicated, we were also outsourcing our help desk operations to a third-party provider in India at the same time we were going through this. So you can imagine, as a project manager, this is about as complicated as I've ever seen it get before. Needless to say, it didn't go very well. But why? At the beginning, we just didn't have the alignment amongst the senior leadership team. So even at our level, reporting into the CIO, we didn't all agree with a clear strategy of the way forward. We knew we had to become and what and all of that context we didn't have agreement on. And so because we didn't have that alignment at the senior leadership level, basically that trickled down through all of their organizations and created a bit more resistance at various levels in the business. We also didn't have very strong stakeholder buy-in with the business. So each of the legacy business representatives as well thought that, well, surely all the other companies would adopt their way of doing things, etc. So we didn't have good stakeholder buy-in. Now, I mentioned about the cultural differences. Yes, we had 43 countries, which is complicated to navigate with an integration like this, but it was also 4 legacy business cultures and all the different local cultures. So even within some countries, we would have multi-location. And as you guys all probably know, I mean, a different location can, even within the same company and in the same country, can have a very different feel for our culture. And that was a level of complexity that our integration team just was not prepared to handle. Just to add one more layer of complexity, our communications were weak. We didn't have enough of it. What we did have was predominantly via email with the occasional town halls. But then let's pause for a second. I was talking about we all have different ways of processing information, ways that we want to receive information, etc. Well, we made one of the classic mistakes where we had techies giving tech updates in tech language to the business, which I probably don't have to elaborate here. It didn't always go very well. So what ended up happening with that was we recognized, sadly, in a very painful way, just how much it cost us as a business because we failed to get that proper buy-in in the beginning, to get the buy-in on the strategy, to get the stakeholder buy-in, to communicate, and to get people engaged from the start. So the outcome of that situation was that we had our help desk integration, as you can imagine, failed at a number of levels, which then gave people ammunition to point fingers and say, we knew this wasn't going to work. And it created more resistance across the business. Deadlines and budgets flew out the window. And it took over 4 years before that organization started to really resemble anything that looked like that New Beginnings. So the lessons we learned there was about what failing to get people on board can cost the business. It took us significantly longer than predicted to integrate. We had tremendously more costs. We had a negative impact to the business, both in technical support, like with outages and things like that, because of practical things that happen, but also a huge loss of confidence in the function with the business, which you guys probably have experienced this before. When reputationally you lose a lot of credibility with the business, it's very hard to earn that back. But then we also lost a lot of really good people who, quite frankly, just got a bit fed up and didn't want to deal with it anymore. So what I've learned from that is what I've applied with my model here, and I want to talk with you all a bit more about, is how do we actually get people engaged? And really, we do have to focus on engaging and connecting with people at the head and heart level. And this is focusing on where people are at the time versus where we want them to be. We have to meet people with where they are. So we can't just treat the situation as, well, everybody will get on board. Yes, sometimes we can go through projects and change programs where, you know what, it's one of those situations where everybody's just going to have to get on board because we don't have a choice in this. And we can drive programs forward when we have those kinds of situations. But my experience has taught me that when we do, it's usually a superficial level of change or adaptation, because underneath, if people haven't genuinely bought into it, then a lot of times what they'll have is just a high level, yeah, we're integrating this change at a particular level, but at the core, nothing's really changed. And a great example that I've seen of that over the years is finance system implementation. And everybody's using this new tool, and we're celebrating the big win that this new finance tool is in place. But when you actually go to the location, they're still secretly keeping Excel spreadsheets on the back end because it doesn't capture the data that they used to capture in their old system. So people are just doing something manually. And what we find is that actually there's duplication of work, and we're costing twice as much work with this new system because people didn't really adapt. So yes, we can force changes to take place, but unless we actually get people on board with helping them to understand the why behind change, what's in it for them, how does this matter to them? How does it impact them? And connect in a way that they can actually relate to at the head and heart level, then it becomes a lot more difficult for us to actually see true fundamental change. So with that, if we look at back to the Bridges transition model here, we have some tips for what can leaders do in the different stages of the transition. So in the early stages where we have the endings and letting go, it really is about listening to people, understanding their perspective. What are their concerns and fears? Now, sometimes this is a great thing for us to do as well, because we might actually get some heads up on things that we hadn't anticipated. So we have some ideas about how a change program is going to work, but somebody who's been working with this particular tool or process for a long period of time can voice something that we might not have recognized. So there's a dual benefit for us making sure that we're taking the time to listen and hear people out. Obviously, we can only listen for so long before we have to start driving change. So when we get into that neutral zone, it's trying to help people understand the big picture. What's in it for them? Why do we need to make this change? And I have to say, my experience is you can't communicate too much when driving change. Communicating a why behind change at the beginning is great, but it's not enough. It has to keep going over and over and over again, because in this dip where things get really difficult, in this neutral zone and people are trying to find their place and how things work, reinforcing why we're doing it when things are particularly hard is very important to keep the momentum moving forward, because this is when people can dip back and say, you know what, this is just too much. I don't agree with this. And whether consciously or subconsciously, start resisting the change and subverting the change efforts. So this is also a place where we want to develop capabilities. Take this opportunity to retrain people in whatever skills they may need for that new beginnings. Helping train on the new ways of being, clarifying processes and procedures, problem solving. It's really important to spend time here listening to people for addressing whatever concerns might be coming up about the change program, and making sure that we are eliminating barriers that are getting in the way and addressing problems so that people feel like they can continue to move forward. And then obviously when we're in new beginnings, it doesn't let up. We don't just say, whew, it's finished. Okay, great job. We move on. We need to continue the refinement. So it's also about giving feedback, listening to feedback, what's working and not working, continuing to improve processes, etc. So that we're constantly making progress and improving the way of working. Okay. Now, again, in talking about this, it's not enough just to communicate a few times throughout. It's really about over communicating. Sometimes if it feels like you're communicating just a bit too much, you're probably getting it about right. Okay. And the other thing is to communicate in a variety of ways in different settings. Sometimes it may be large groups. So I mentioned town halls. We often do a lot of change program communication in town halls. That's great, but it's not enough. Some people won't speak up in a town hall. So it's important for you to do small groups or one-to-ones. If you have a team that you're driving change with, one-on-one conversation for those more introverted people who might not feel comfortable to speak up in a group setting. Communicating in email for those people who want to take in information, digest it, and then come back later with questions. So it's a variety of ways, in writing, in person, in groups, individually, etc., so that you are giving people an opportunity, depending upon their own style and preferences, to be able to speak up, to ask questions, to offer input. Without doing it in that mixed sort of way, we're actually stifling some of the idea creation and the input that we might need that could make our change program better. Now, also, I mentioned, bear with me 1 second, I want to go back. I mentioned too about that people think and process information differently. Some people resonate well with big picture. Others want fine details, right? And have a lot of curiosities about exactly how things are going to operate. Some people respond better to facts and data. Others respond better to stories, emotions. So the better you know people in your team, the more you can customize communications that appeal to everyone. So if we go back to that example that I shared before about the tech group, using tech language, communicating to the business, a lot of it didn't resonate. It was foreign, you know, and it just created more issues with credibility because people didn't understand what we were talking about. So making sure that just because a communication resonates well with you doesn't mean it's going to resonate well with all of your audience. So having a mix of data, facts, emotions, stories, you know, creating that compelling reason for people to get on board with a variety of ways and communicating in a lot of different settings will really help you with the change. And then also the power of listening, creating those feedback loops at various levels in the organization. So it's sometimes unrealistic to expect that people will come directly to the person, the senior most leader who's leading a change program. How can we create feedback mechanisms at all levels in the organization so that we are ensuring that people are voicing concerns and that we're able to address those? Sometimes it might be something that could prevent our change program from being successful, and sometimes it's just being able to understand the fears, concerns, worries that people have so that we can alleviate those by talking about them. So with that, coming back to the change model, again, I would just say some of the biggest tips for me are don't underestimate the power of investing a lot of time in communications, generating buy-in, and getting people engaged. I know sometimes it's hard when we have aggressive timelines with projects, we have deadlines, to be able to spend extra time communicating, etc. But it actually can be the key to making sure that your change program is implemented in a way that you wish. So it's not just about project updates and status updates. I know we all like a good spreadsheet with the red, yellow, green of how we're progressing on projects. I love them myself. And sadly, when I moved to the UK, I think I had about 120 line Excel spreadsheet on a personal level with my red, yellow, green status on all my actions. So yeah, most project managers, we do like those kinds of things, but we need to be able to communicate about the impact of change and what's really happening and what's the benefit of it versus just project and status updates as well. So there's a lot more to getting people on board with change than just communicating and explaining the why behind it. But again, as I mentioned at the start, that my experience has been that is the single biggest failing point of most leaders in not recognizing the importance of investing that time and energy at the start. So as project and program managers, I think you guys already said this in your responses to the survey, the success of your programs and the change that you're leading isn't about having the latest tools and technology and the richest budgets and meeting those deadlines. It really is about the degree of implementation. And that is done by connecting to the heads and hearts of people to change their behaviors and ways of working. So with that, that concludes all of the content I wanted to share, Katrina. I'd love to hear from people what they thought was the most valuable tip that we've shared, and then we can take some Q&A and I can give you guys some information about other resources I have if we have time as well.
So I'm just sharing the question there, Adrienne, and there has, we have a question from John here as well on the Zoom chat. And this, I think this is something that's a pain point for a lot of us. How do you deal with the naysayer in the organization? Doesn't matter what it is, and how do you minimize the negative effect on other members' buy-in? It's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, John, we've all had those, and they're just the bane of our existence sometimes when it comes to driving change. But you know, one of the ways is if you can actually invest a bit more time with that individual to understand why it is that they're a naysayer. Is there something about this particular change or the solution that we're trying to go with that they can't buy into, and why? What is the barrier that they have to getting on board with it? If you can spend some time investing with them to understand that and help to unpick that and be able to offer them some perspective that maybe it's not quite what they thought it was, or, you know, giving them an opportunity to contribute to a solution that might be better, that's great. But at the end of the day, we all know we're going to have some of those naysayers. If you can convert one of the naysayers to be an advocate for the program, it can be very challenging, but if you can make them one of your change champions and give them a role and a responsibility with some accountability in driving the change, that will sometimes shift that behavior as well. So I'd say, listen, ask the question, try to understand their perspective and see if you can offer a different perspective, or they may have some solutions that you can make some change that helps them to adopt or adapt to the change a bit more easily. See if they can play a role in driving the change, give them some more responsibility. And then last but not least, it's sort of that, how do we mute a little bit of the naysaying and set expectations for how they support the change program if there's not a way to modify it to where they can feel comfortable getting on board with it.
I would say as well, Adrienne, because I'm currently managing a compliance project. We don't really have a choice in it. And
Yeah.
one of the things I've seen over the years across any project is there can be a bit of a tendency sometimes to overly accommodate the person who doesn't want the change. And that, from my experience, that's been where getting senior management or getting your sponsor involved is very important, because somebody needs to make a senior decision as to how much accommodation is too much. And I've really seen it get out of hand on projects as well. So I do think that there is also a time where someone needs to be sat down with somebody senior and told, this is how this is going to be. Because project managers, we have to remember, we're all at different stages in the organization. Some of us can be quite junior. I mean, I've gone all the way through from project admin right through to program management. So you have to get the backing of the sponsors as well to say, listen, how much accommodation is the line, and at what point is a gentle nudge required for this person to move forward, essentially.
Particularly when you have regulatory compliance, these kinds of things where it's non-negotiable. It is what it is, right? We've got to get on board. You know, still, I would say listening to the person, letting them share whatever concerns they have. But at the end of the day, it's right, we're going to get on with this, and you've got to be on board with it. There's no option not to be. And you're exactly right. Yeah, we can't get to the point where we're investing too much time and energy into that one person. We invest for a point, and then at some point we say, enough's enough, they've got to get on board, right?
True enough. You've got a couple of questions, actually. So Eamon has asked, have you any tips on how to take the emotion out of change? I think that's the $1 million question right there. But
yeah, don't involve humans. That's really the answer. And the sad thing is, at the end of every system or tool or whatever, there is always a human. So sadly, is it Eamon? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yep. I think that, yeah, Eamon. Yep.
Yeah, Eamon. Yeah, sadly, I don't know of any way to take the emotion out of it. Obviously, some people have a little bit more emotion than others. I happen to be one of those people who's emotionally charged, you know, and others are very, you know, reserved with it. But other than that, I really don't have a tip for that. I'm really sorry.
I would say a lot of it is in the listening as well. That's one of the tips that I would take from this, is that I would have maybe a tendency to try and answer all the questions and even anticipate what their issue is. Like, let them tell you what their issue is and then answer it, because often they may just want to speak out and just say that they're frustrated with the change.
Sometimes they just want
they're going to get on with it anyway.
And another thing that I'll point out too is that we, as the change leaders, bear in mind, we go through that change process too. So that change curve, we're going through it as well. But as change leaders, we usually hear about it before everybody else. And we've had time to adapt and go through our own internal process before we're telling people. So one mistake I often see people who are change leaders making is, well, I'm already on with it, they should be on with it too. No, they're hearing about it at a different point, and everybody is different. So we have to recognize that it can be really frustrating and try our patience, but we have to recognize that people are going to move through that curve at a different time, and we've had more time to adjust to it typically. So that's important as well.
And Adrienne, Jackie, who actually is our chapter president, has joined us today, and she's asked the question, what have you found personally the most challenging aspects to change in your career? It's outside of projects. That's an interesting take on it.
Yeah, so I'm curious, Jackie, is that about changes I've made in my career, or in my career making changes which have been the most difficult? Just curious if you can chime in. Is she able to communicate on here?
Yeah, she can chat. Yeah, yeah.
So if I say from driving change, what I've found to be most difficult, quite candidly, it's culture. You know, projects as far as like system implementations or processes or policies or structural, even organizational structure, some of that stuff can be easier, but it's actually culture. So let's say if you're changing an organizational structure and a hierarchy changes, well, on a piece of paper in an org chart, it looks very, very different, but the way human beings actually interact with each other and work is a completely different thing. It's like the hidden part of the iceberg, that how things are really done. Also, if there's been a culture established by a particular leader that perhaps hasn't been positive and somebody else is coming in, or you've got the opposite, things around culture changes where trying to influence people's perceptions about the team, the organization, or how they work differently or engage or trying to drive collaboration, those are typically what I found to be the most difficult. Oh, and thank you, Jackie. So in my career making changes, it has also been leaving corporate and starting my own business. So I left the corporate environment 6 years ago to do my own thing, and I've now been consulting, speaking, facilitating workshops, and doing one-on-one coaching for the last 5.5 years. And obviously that was an enormous personal change after 20 years of corporate environment. It's was quite a personal change for me.
Did you find, just from your own experience of making that change, how did your family or your close friends react to that? I mean, because leaving the comfort and security of corporate to go out on your own is, even thinking about it, thinking there's a lot of things that you need to take care of that you don't normally need to take care of.
Exactly. A lot of people were concerned for me. And actually, my father, I adore him. I speak to him about every week on FaceTime. I kid you not, almost every week he says, have you gotten a real job yet? Because the fact that I run my own business and have done for 5.5 years successfully, to my dad, it's like, no, you need to work for somebody. Do you have a real job yet? So yeah, it can be quite difficult for people around us to adapt to that as well.
Very good. And one last question here. I think you can still see my screen with people coming back with their feedback. But we've one question here. Do you have any tips on how to get the message across when you are the client who sets the vision, but the change is being implemented by your service provider on your behalf? That's actually a very astute question, because a lot of us would be in that situation for sure.
I would say helping them understand the why and the impact. And this is where helping the vendor, the service provider, to be able to understand what it is you're trying to drive and the level of accountability that you're holding them to for driving that, the impact to your business. It's more about giving them the why really clearly, but also the feeling, helping them understand your environment, whether it's your team, your business, etc., to understand the cultural context that they're coming into and what it is that you're wanting to change about that. If you can help them add some color to it so that they get a real feel. It's not just about, I want a tool implementation and I want it by January 1st, but why that tool? What is it that you're trying to drive? What behavior, what impact to the business is it that you're wanting to achieve? What's gone before that maybe they should be aware of that is going to have an impact on how people engage? So as much color and context as you can provide to that would be really helpful.
There's a lot of context here. There's one last question here from Dom before we close out, and it's, if 100% represents the project effort, what percentage from your experience would represent the people management effort throughout the project?
You know,
I feel like that's a loaded question now, I have to say.
I'm going to be really biased, and I would say that, to be candid, probably 3/4 of it has to do with the people element, with probably 1/4 of it around the project itself, because unless we get people to change, ultimately the rest of it doesn't matter. Now, Katrina, I had an offering that I wanted to share with people. I don't know if we have time.
Yes. Yeah, go for it.
I've got it's a slightly different topic, but I had written an ebook earlier this year during the first phases of lockdown around leading through the heart of a storm. It's from my experience of working through several major crises in business, as well as some context to COVID. So I'm going to send this so that Katrina can share with you guys the link to download it. Totally free. Just go onto my website. You can download this if it'll help. It also helps you with driving change in general. And then next week, I'll put out some additional resources that might be valuable. So I'll post some of these to the LinkedIn group, and then I send out an email next week to some of that as well, so that there are some additional resources to help you.
That'd be great. And actually, there was a few comments throughout about the graphs that you shared being very useful and very helpful. So, and I think it's nice because I think we're all maybe familiar with the change curve, but to sort of see the annotations on it and, you know, the various emotions that you go through when you get it is a helpful reminder for sure. So,
and I know that connect with me. I mean, I obviously you guys can tell I love this topic. So I'd love to chat with you about what works and what challenges you may have in your business. So all kinds of ways to connect with me. I'd love to hear more from you guys. I know we're limited on time today, but follow up, feel free to engage with me, whichever platform works for you.
Brilliant. And we will share the slides afterwards as well, so you guys will see those. So I'll do the usual wrap up for everyone that's familiar. We do, for anyone that's attended today and attended the live webinar, if I can decipher who you are from your login, which I usually can, we will make sure that we register the PDU for you, which is important because it goes towards your certification. And Adrienne mentioned there about the ebook and also about some follow-up resources. So we will also ensure that we share whatever Adrienne shares with us with the members on the archive page. So, and that's usually up within a couple of days of the webinar as well. And you can, you'll be able to see a follow back of the recording as well in a couple of days as well. So don't forget that it's mostly webinars at this moment in time, and while we're looking at different ways to reach out to our members and our audience outside of webinars, for the time being, we have about 5 more webinars posted that you can register for. And you can also check out projectmanagement.com and PMI ECC, where you will find other webinars from the international PMI and from ECC is the European one. So you will find them in different languages as well, which can be useful because not everyone, it's kind of handy for people who maybe are a French speaker or a German speaker. It's good practice as well. So that's it from me, I think. Adrienne, thank you so much. And like I said, a lot of the comments, people were very interested in the graphics that you shared as well. So I think it's been a very informative session.
Great. And I'll definitely send those slides so that we can share them with everyone as well.
Super. Okay, look, guys, thank you very much, Adrienne. And thanks everyone for joining us. And we will talk again next week. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Adrienne. Bye.